Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Human Echoes recap for Legion Season 2, Episode 6. And here we are in another one of these oddly diversionary episodes of this show. In my mind, this is kind of the twin of Episode 4's exploration of Sid. That was an episode that did not advance the plot, right? But it did give us needed insight into a character that had not been established enough beforehand. And this episode does not advance the plot in any obvious way. We'll find out if any of these Davids play into how things are going to go in the future. But right now it feels just sort of like this could just be an offshoot and then we continue on with the main story. And it provides something very needed for a character that I don't think was fleshed out enough earlier in the show, who is Amy, right? We just finished up last episode's big gut punch moment where it's revealed that Lenny is Amy's body with, Lenny's DNA morphed it, and now Amy's gone, and we get to experience David's sort of gut punch of grief and pain at losing his sister. And maybe this is just me, okay? Maybe all of y'all were super on board with Amy and understood her and felt connected to her as a character, but I had almost forgotten she existed at this point. And this episode, despite all of its fascinating, wild, multi-timeline trappings, and I do love all that, at some level it's performing at least, it's maybe not all that it's doing, but it's definitely helping with filling in the gaps of what we know about Amy. It says, oh, by the way, we know we didn't give you, the biggest reason to care about Amy up until now, but now that she's gone, mostly anyway, here's why she mattered. We didn't fill that in beforehand. We didn't really give you, a great way to grab onto this character, so here's sort of a in memoriam post-mortem thing about what she meant or could have meant in David's life. And I think that that's really interesting and clever. I think it would have been nice if the show had, done something a little bit more with the character before now. But if you're going to wait until after she's dead, at least you are going to really give us a reason to care. And this episode does a good job of that. And it kicks off with kind of a montage of these many Davids, all right? We have homeless David. We have old David getting a sponge bath. I believe he's in this part. He eventually shows up anyway. We have billionaire David. And those are the three big important timelines here. Homeless, billionaire, and super old David. And this episode explores this idea of a branching timeline. And the other important thing I think that this episode really does is that it highlights the importance of choice. And choice is something that we've been kind of putting our, foot in the water a little bit, talking about up till now in the story, with David looking at the future and, future Sid says, is coming back and telling him to do something different. And he's, Farouk is implying that would kill off future Sid. Just as a side note that I just thought of, one of the things this episode maybe does is sort of lets David off the hook for that and says, no, if he saves the world, future Sid still exists in some other weird timeline, but just David's timeline goes on happily. But there is definitely that aspect of that, choices matter and they can make these huge differences in your life. And the first one we get into in depth is we flash back to a younger version of David who is still on an alternate timeline from our David, and he's a coffee boy at a business law firm something. It's not specifically clear, although somebody on the subreddit pointed out a really cool detail that there's a D3 on the wall for Division 3. There's a big D with the 3 Roman numerals in the middle of it. A little detail, sort of blink and you miss it kind of thing. That's just why I love having the resource of having a bunch of other fans on the internet, because I can go and look that stuff up and be like, oh, I didn't see that. It's cool, and I can tell you guys about it. And he, to cut sort of not a very long story, but longer story short, kills this deal that is being planned between two companies or maybe a government oversight agency or something. They're about to sign a deal, and he goes to the person who's the company's trying to sucker into signing this deal when they know they've got these lawsuits coming up, and says, hey, one, I'm psychic, and two, you really got to look at this thing. They're not telling you everything. There's something about some fire hazards or whatever. And she takes his advice and also takes him with her, which seems like, especially knowing what we know about David now, knowing his path through Clockworks and his sort of troubled past, this feels like optimum David to start with. It's like, yeah, why couldn't our David be like that? He's psychic, he's just cool with it. Why not just like roll with your powers, my man? But we get into some reasons why that might not be ideal a little bit later. Next up, we have someone I'm going to call Derry David. And Derry David is the version of David that is heavily medicated, but is out in the world kind of doing his own thing. He's, a sort of diversity hire. He's got, I don't know if that's the right word. I think that's what we called them at Walmart when you would hire somebody who was a little bit slow, but they could do some stuff. He's managed to find a job, but he's not like going anywhere in the world. And it's rough to see this version of David because he's close to our version. He's got the mental problems, but he's been drugged down so heavily so that he can be out in society that he's completely kind of non-functional. And one of the things that I noticed, by the way, and I'm sure other eagle-eyed viewers were watching for this as well, as this Derry David shows up, there's a huge wall of boxes that are all green on the outside. And if you look at the signage around those green boxes, there are green like warning signs and green eye wash station labels, which I can tell you as someone who has worked in a back room of a place before, those things are not usually green. They are usually red. So just playing into that sort of red is green, green is red thing. I don't know if that's ever going to come back in like a meaningful way, if it's ever going to hit. The fact they planted that seed and then keep showing us green things that might also be red is a fun little game to play with the show, but where's it going? Maybe nowhere. That's the best that I could tell. And the other important thing is we mentioned Amy is in this version of David's life. And she is calling him and reminding him to take his pill. And not even just, she doesn't just text him. She hasn't set up an alert on his phone. She has taken time out of her day to call him up on the telephone and wait for him to take the pill and then say, like, I'm going to come pick you up. This is clearly going to be an investiture of her time throughout his life. And we see in one of the iterations of this David going forward that she spends her entire life taking care of him. That into old age, she is there for him through thick and thin. We don't see her with a significant other at this point, so she's given that up. She's obviously given up many, many other opportunities to help her brother. And this is the version of Amy, despite the fact that it doesn't create a David that we know that sort of can help people and do things. From the Amy timelines, this is the one that really sort of hit home for me the most as, oh wow, okay, this person is, at least has the capacity for amazing selflessness and, really loves her brother and is willing to give up a lot of stuff for him. And I thought that was one of the best tributes kind of to this character, again, post-mortem kind of. I don't know if she's actually dead. I don't know how dead works when they swap your body into another person's body, and maybe some of your memories are still trapped in there, but it seems bad for her in any case. And beyond this, we get Tweaker David. Tweaker David seems to be the version of David that has essentially done nothing to deal with his illness, except, well, maybe he's self-medicating. Obviously, he's on something, but it's not necessarily doctor prescribed. And by the way, this is going to be like a blanket statement, but Tweaker David, his face looks like someone who started doing meth. He has those like patches on his face where they start to pick at things and really mess their faces up. If you've seen sort of progression pictures of people who are on meth, they don't look good. And there are a number of makeup effects in this episode. Billionaire David is relatively old, and they make him look suitably old, but it's like a guy who's probably been taking care of himself. And then homeless David, who we're going to get to in a little bit, he looks like super old, and they've messed with the age lines on his face. And David Haller, I'm sorry, not David Haller, Dan Stevens, the actor, just throws himself into these roles like crazy. It's almost a completely different character each time. It's still recognizable as David, but really impressive how he pulls it off, because it's such a range of things. I mean, going from, crazy old David, and again, this is a young dude. Like if it was sort of another TV show, you would actually cast somebody old. But the fact that his voice is so flexible, and part of that is from the fact that he has done voice work before. I remember listening to an NPR interview with him recently where he was talking about that he did a lot of work for Audible for a while when he was sort of first starting out, and really enjoyed making all the different voices for the books. I haven't actually listened to any audiobooks that he does, but it's clear that some of that work has paid off, because in addition to all the makeup, he really nails sort of the different tics and vocal tenor of all of these different people and how they would present themselves to the world. Amazing job. If you thought Dan Stevens was just some pretty boy who they stuck in this role, dude has got some acting chops. And there's almost no Sid in this episode. I found that very interesting. I think that it's a storytelling decision to focus more on Amy, but the fact that many of these sort of broken Davids are Davids that never met Sid, I think is also kind of an indicator of where he went. I think I got off track, though, talking about Tweaker David, I was going to say that he breaks down the premise of the episode. In case you're watching this and you're like, why are all these different people looking like David and different? Well, he says, it's the many worlds hypothesis, and we can branch out into different timelines depending on the choices we make, and there's a version of me that's a billionaire or something, and a version of me that has a cool family, and all of these, sort of setting up these different branches. By the way, cool family David, I don't know what the point of that was, other than to sort of tease us with the fact that he could just have a normal life if he maybe didn't have these powers. But there's a lot of this episode that feels kind of like dead ends, like intentionally dead ends, but it doesn't do too much to delve into why they showed us exactly this, other than to say, hey, maybe there's a version of David that didn't have powers, didn't get Farouk in him, and he just has a happy life. That's possible. We then see homeless David fighting with these guys who the subtitles labeled the Droogs. I looked that up. That's a reference to Clockwork Orange, which I have not read or seen the movie, so sorry, not cultured enough yet. Maybe I will at some point. But they come on him, and they're gonna, take him out. And old David has some interesting lines here. He says, homeless David, he says, did he send you? Which I assume means Farouk. This is, at some level, a version of David that has found out about Farouk, that has at least managed to banish him from his mind, possibly on his own. And here he is living as a homeless man because he never got the support system from, the other mutants that came and saved him in episode 1, as we see in the montage. But at least he did have some level of victory. And here these guys are, and essentially old David says, put me out of my misery, and then isn't able to stop himself from just wiping them out. And the rest of old David's story here feels like kind of a cascade from that moment. And it jumps around a little bit, right? But what follows after that is that I think sort of Division 3 or some other mutant, somebody picks up on this sort of massive discharge of power that he uses to just wipe out these hooligans. They send some cops after him. Or maybe the cops come later. It's a somewhat unclear, but he takes out the cops, and then they send more cops. And eventually, it's Carrie, who is still young in David's old age, which raises questions about older Carrie's, like how we don't see other boy Carrie in this one. I assume that he's still present if he's still able to pop out young Carrie, but I don't. Again, maybe it doesn't do to dwell too much on the details of the things we don't see until we are given more information about them. But she straight up kills him, and no indication that like she knew him or that she cared about him or that she regretted doing this. She's just there for the action. And this is probably a version of Carrie that's never interacted with Dave before, and she just slices him right in half with her katana, because that's what Carrie does. Very cool intro for her, by the way. I enjoyed they showed like a lower third of her sort of walking along, and the color scheme for her initially made me think it was Sid for some reason. I don't know why my brain went that direction, if that is Sid's colors or if I'm just off on third base with that, but she eventually, it's not Sid, okay? That's just sort of what I was expecting. She kills David, Hobo David. In the meantime, or in the alternate time, I don't know how to say that, but Billionaire David is talking about how great he is and essentially setting himself up as a god. And he has now surpassed. This is the version of David that was the coffee boy and gave the warning to the woman at the meeting about the faulty what were they, transistors or something, who knows, things that started fires. And he has now risen with his power to the point where she's like his secretary, and she's not happy about it. She can remember the time when she plucked him, in her mind, out of obscurity and put him on a path, and now the path has led him to being her boss and her being, basically subservient to him, and he loves that she feels that way. I got into a little bit of an argument on Reddit with someone who was like, I don't see what's so bad about Billionaire David. Billionaire David's a psychopath. Okay? That's what's wrong with Billionaire David. He doesn't care about, not only does he not care about other people, he enjoys the suffering of other people. He put people in positions where they would be suffering. So he gives a speech about how the Tower of Babel, God came down and confounded the languages, but because of his psychic power, he is sort of the unconfounder, the reuniter, and he deserves this place. He goes and talks to Amy, and it's clear that Amy isn't a big part of Billionaire David's life, other than sort of coming to him with her hand out. And she's asking for another house. Her life is miserable. And this is not explicitly stated, but I think Billionaire David enjoys the fact that her life is miserable, because here's my vision of this, that he has put her on this path to being comfortable, to having everything she wanted, and still being completely unfulfilled. And I think that there's a part of him that loves to see her that way, that just like trying to figure out what went wrong in her life. And the reason I think this is because after this scene, we get a very brief moment where Billionaire David's looking in the mirror and he sees Farouk. And my interpretation of this is that this iteration of David not only embraced his powers, but totally went on board with Farouk's plan. That him and Farouk have been working together this whole time, that he has gone with what Farouk wants and let Farouk whisper in his ear or possibly take over some of the time, and that in this world, David and Farouk have teamed up. I don't know that Farouk has taken over necessarily. I don't think that's possible. That's one way to interpret that this is just Farouk the whole way. but I think that this is definitely a view of what happens if Farouk convinces David to help him out like he wants him to, and pushes all of his buttons. Derry David has a showdown on the road and gets shot by the cops, at which point, and this is a rough scene to watch, where he's pleading for his life, and you think about a lot of the sort of stories about police brutality you hear these days, and it's difficult to know, sort of incident to incident exactly who to believe, because there's so much charged political tension on both sides. But especially in a story, it's very effective, and it comes across as this guy, you see that he has this power, right? And we haven't seen Derry David use his power up until now, but he lashes out and just, smashes one of these guys into nothing before he gets shot, or maybe after he gets shot. I forget exactly the timeline, but it was one of the most gruesome deaths that I've seen on Legion, and then just wipes everything out. And there's two, I think, branches of this version of David that we see. Initially, there is the branch that leads to the graveside, where Amy's visiting him and he's gone and she's mourning him. But probably better for Amy, honestly, that he's gone. Amy with David in her life is just like miserable. And then there is the version of his life where he's paralyzed by the bullet, and he's the old guy who she's been taking care of this whole time. Kind of a fun little mirror of his dad, by the way, if we're assuming that it's Professor X, and can't think of any reason not to, that he ends up bald and in a wheelchair and not really able to do much. Although, Professor X was using his power, but this version of David is just sort of drugged out. And then we get the real version of David, the version of David that goes to Clockworks, and we see sort of a montage of the incidents that have brought him to this point, and cut all the way up to the moment that he figures out what's going on with Lenny and why she has different colored eyes. And now this moment for me has a lot more power. Okay? Again, maybe for everybody else, they were super attached to Amy and they had a good idea of who she was, but especially knowing that this character could have taken care of David as essentially a paralyzed man on, heavy medication for the rest of his life, and a very long life it was in one of these timelines. It really, I think, puts a lot of credit on her side as someone who was able to, I was going to say put up with, and I don't want to stigmatize people with mental illness by implying that, fine, we got to put up with you. But it is extra work for her, like a lot of extra work. And I think that version of Amy really spoke to me the most. And now to know that David, who did not know that version of Amy, by the way, as far as we can tell, all of these disparate timelines are kind of for our benefit only. There's no indication in my mind that David experienced all of these split up timelines for himself. This is essentially purely for the viewer's benefit. It's not, as I mentioned earlier, as far as I can tell, not going to advance the plot at all. I can't see, billionaire David crosses over the time stream and fights regular David, or Derry David comes in and does something. The guy, the pencil pusher David, who I didn't really mention because he doesn't have much of a role here, but who saw a dancing mouse. I don't think he's going to show up like in the season finale and say, me and my dancing mouse are a crime fighting team now. We're going to kick some butt. Hi-ya! And the little mouse on his shoulder goes, hi-ya! Given that this is Legion, I'm not going to completely rule that out, okay? And I will think it's awesome if it happens. I'm just saying right now, it seems like this is just, again, this is just for our benefit. This is just sort of planting the seed after the plant has been cut down. Oh, by the way, Amy, awesome person. Y'all didn't appreciate her enough. David appreciated her, and now she's gone. And it really makes me feel for his anger against Farouk a lot more. And the fact that the closing words of the episode are Farouk saying, you get to choose your reality, you make your reality. I think that is maybe something that ties in with this whole many worlds hypothesis, right? Not that David can just, I mean, we've seen that he can just make things disappear, but really that the choices that you make affect things, and not just for yourself, right? A lot of these were, I think, at least some of these were Mary's choices. Amy's choices. Some of them were David's choices on the way as well. But all of us choosing things at once in a giant cauldron is the thing that creates our reality, and we should maybe be a little bit more careful about what we choose. It also, I think, is clear to me that maybe the version of David we have is the best possible version. Every other version of David is either, well, except for Family Man David, who can't help anybody, but he's at least happy. Homeless David, not able to do much, sort of as a hero in the world. All right, billionaire David can trick himself into thinking that he's helping, and maybe he does, feed people and bring people together and stuff. Maybe he is the good force for good that he says, but he's also a sociopath in my mind. Derry David is just nerfed to not being able to do anything, and so the version of David we have with all of his flaws is sort of the best balance that he could have had out of all of these many worlds that we saw, and I think that's worth knowing as well. That is all I have for this episode, guys. If you have other stuff that you think I should have mentioned, or things you think I got wrong, or just stuff you want to tell me about, leave it in the comments. I love to read those, and I try to answer every one that I can. And that'll do it for this week. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next week with another episode of the Legion Recap. Take care, y'all.